Welcome to Green and Red, Scrappy Politics for Scrappy People, a regular podcast on radical environmental and anti-capitalist politics, brought to you by Bob Bazanko and Scott Parkin.
Welcome to the silky smooth sounds of the Green and Red podcast. I'm your co-host, Scott Parkin, calling in from Berkeley, California today, watching the world burn almost 3 months now. But as always, I am joined by
Bob Bazanko, and for the very last time in Houston, Texas, half of the GNR media empire will be permanently moving to Ohio very soon at the end of the month.
No more Texas connection.
Yeah, once you're a Texan, it's deep in your heart. So,
that's true. That's true.
Getting out just in time. Not like Ohio's really much different anymore, but anyway, it's been wild. It's been a ride, hasn't it?
Yeah, it's been quite the time that you and we have had in the great state of Texas.
Yeah. Yeah, you were there for about 10 years, 15 years?
10. I was born and raised there, but I lived in Houston for 10 years.
Yeah, that's what I meant. Right. Yeah, I've been there 30. So
30.
I'm officially ancient.
You're young at heart, though, Bob.
When I got here, Bill Clinton was still in his first term, and I was just like thinking, oh man, this is bad. I just was bitching all the time about how bad things were, and those are going to be our good old days.
It's the golden age.
Yeah.
Speaking of times where we thought things were bad, we're going to do what's mostly a history and legacy of an event sort of episode today. This week is the 50th anniversary of the fall of Saigon. And Bob has a lot of background in the history of the Vietnam War, has written a couple of books on it, and has taught it for 30 years or more. And then I also studied it quite a bit. So I'm under Bob. And so 2 years ago, we did a episode on the U.S. pullout of Vietnam. We've done other shows on Vietnam. It's a topic that's near and dear to our hearts. And so today we're going to be talking a little bit about the fall of Saigon, some of the background, the actual event, and then some of the legacy of it.
Yeah, we'll be brief on the background because, like you said, we did a show in January of 1973 about the American part of the war, the peace treaty, American withdrawal. And then we also interviewed Noam Chomsky at that point too. So we'll put links to those in. So today, we don't really need to go into detail. I think just talking a little bit about the end of the war. And then I think it's more important just to discuss what Vietnam means in the long term, what it means today, because we're seeing two major conflicts in Ukraine and obviously the destruction of Palestine. And I think it does bring to mind a lot of stuff that was going on in the Vietnam era. So it's worth talking about. It'll be the 50th anniversary, not just of the end of the Vietnam War, but also the Vietnam War ends with communist victory, right? They march into the South, the Saigon, and take over. That same thing happened that same week in Cambodia and Laos. So all of Indochina fell. It was really one could argue that in the Cold War period, it was America's gravest defeat or defeats. Although what's happening now in the Middle East is, who knows how that's going to turn out. That could end up being even worse. And obviously the impact of the two Gulf Wars is catastrophic, but Vietnam is a big deal is the point. Let me just say a few things about the background. I think pretty much everyone is familiar with the earlier, not familiar, but I think we know more about the earlier stages of the war. The Kennedy years, the Johnson years. Kennedy ramps up Vietnam, makes it a major issue, has a coup because the U.S. isn't doing well. He's all in, despite what Oliver Stone and his people say. That's just preposterous. Kennedy died. LBJ picked up the torch and continued that. You had Tonkin, and then you had the deployment of ground troops and more American troops getting in, search and destroy operations, B-52s. And that brings us to, at some point, you have over 500,000 American troops, and then you get Tet. And Tet is really a turning point because it showed that despite all these American claims about how things were going well, that clearly wasn't the case, and the enemy could strike pretty much any time it chose, and it did during the Tet Offensive. From that point on, you get this period, which is often referred to as Vietnamization. So the U.S. after Tet decides, okay, this probably isn't going to end well, so we need to start figuring out a way to wind it down. And the answer becomes Vietnamization, which I think is very funny in an Orwellian sense, because the war is the Vietnam War. You're in Vietnam defending a half of a country that you invented, and you're going to Vietnamize it. You're turning over the war to the Vietnamese, right? And that's clearly proof that it was an American. the Americanization process. So they decide they're going to Vietnamize the war. American troops start coming out, but the war doesn't really wind down that much because Richard Nixon, remember, campaigned, I'm going to end the war and there'll be peace with honor. And he actually even had backdoor emissaries in southern Vietnam talking to the South Vietnamese saying, hey, don't cut a deal. Don't end the war like Johnson wants you to because we want to win the election and we'll give you a better deal. So all that stuff is going on. And what Nixon does is shift focus to like really overwhelming air power that had been used extensively already. By the end of the war, Vietnam alone would have 4.6 million tons of bombs dropped on it. And then Cambodia and Laos would be wiped out too, with equally catastrophic consequences. The Khmer Rouge in Cambodia, and obviously Laos today in 2025, 50 years later, still has 80 million unexploded plus bombs. They're called bomblets or bombies from cluster bombs. 80 million today are still unexploded in the region. Huge impact. But so Nixon comes in, decides to wind the war down. You get far more air power. You get massive American bombing campaigns like Linebacker 1, and they're having negotiations at the same time. The U.S. isn't necessarily negotiating, I think, in great faith, right? They're making these demands, and when the Vietnamese meet their demands, the U.S. either shifts or whatever. By 1972, I think this is when we get to the important stuff. By early 1972, it's fairly clear that the war isn't going to be won. And there are a lot of theories on why the United States stays in it, but it's fairly clear the war isn't going to be won. The Northern Vietnamese at this point decide it's time to go to try to push it, to facilitate, to accelerate the end of the war, and began in the spring that year, the Easter Offensive. And the Easter Offensive was mainly conducted by the Northern Regular Army, the PAV and the People's Army of Vietnam. There were also forces already in Southern Vietnam, like the Viet Cong and the PLAF. The PAV crossed the 17th parallel and rapidly broke down the Southern Army, the ARVN. And really quickly, they're in control of some of the kind of northern provinces in Southern Vietnam, in the ARVN, below the 17th parallel. And it was only really overwhelming American power. This is the famous John Paul Mann comes in and takes over, and the United States unleashes overwhelming power to stop the offensive. The Vietnamese offensive also slowed down because they had made progress so much more rapidly than they assumed they would. They were like outrunning their logistics as well. At any rate, it's pretty clear then by the summer of 1972 that the war isn't going well. This is also, not coincidentally, the beginning of the Watergate scandal. Richard Nixon is paranoid. He's going to lose the election and sends, who was it, Lydian Hunt, right?
Right. The plumbers.
Into the Watergate building, just a botch. Nixon called it a third-rate burglary, and right about it. But so that's going on simultaneously. Nixon in the summer of 1972, believed that ending the Vietnam War would be better for him in the election. And this is really an important point, right? Because this is what kind of leads to things like Watergate and to reopening and reinvigorating talks. Henry Kissinger, who was actually Nixon's national security advisor, not a Secretary of State yet, had been having back-channel talks with the Vietnamese representative, Le Duc Tho. And those kind of picked up speed in 1972. And the Northerners, Le Duc Tho had more or less agreed to Kissinger's plans. And then by the fall of 1972, Nixon himself decided that he didn't need to end the war. And I'm obviously going through this very quickly. He didn't really need to end the war to be elected president. And so Nixon actually does a 180 and ratchets up the attacks against Vietnam. In 1972, this is when you see things like the bombing of Haiphong, bombing of Hanoi, massive destruction, 50-foot craters, blowing up hospitals, right? Calculated barbarism. Two of his aides, Richard Morris and
Anthony
Lake, resigned, right? And by this time, Congress is tired of the Vietnam War. There's not a real momentum to keep it going. But Nixon unleashes this new attack, wins the election very easily, and then continues that with the Easter bombings, right? Le Duc Tho thought he had a deal with Kissinger, but the Southern government, led by Nguyen Van Thu, said, no, we won't agree to that. And so Kissinger then blamed the North Vietnamese, right? What did he call them? Filthy, tawdry shits or something like that. Yeah, something like that. Anyway, After that, Nixon unleashed the Christmas bombings. Now, if you look at government sources, like you go to the Department of State official source, Christmas bombings, and they're going to say that the bombings forced the Northern Vietnamese, the communists, to the negotiating table, and that forced them to agree to end the war. But I always thought it was funny because John Negroponte, and if you know anything about John Negroponte, he's demonic. He's pretty evil, right? But Negroponte even said that the Christmas bombings forced the North Vietnamese to accept all of our concessions, right? And if anything, the Christmas bombings actually forced the United States back to the negotiating table. And the U.S. did. Nixon was wildly unpopular at that point. And this is something I think to remember because like today in 2025, we're dealing with some ugly shit, right? But things can change quickly as well. Nixon won at that point. It may have been the biggest landslide ever, wasn't it?
I think at that point, but yeah,
McGovern won.
I don't know how it compares to 36 and 64, but he won pretty big.
He won everything, but McGovern only won Massachusetts, right?
Yeah,
in D.C. I don't know. Did he even win his own state? I'm not sure he did.
Yeah, I don't think he did.
But at any rate, but by January, Nixon's approval was down to like 38%, just a couple months after he won. And he reads the tea leaves, and the United States and the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, North Vietnam, the Provisional Revolutionary Government, the Southern forces in Southern Vietnam, and the government of Southern Vietnam, the RVN. Those parties came to an agreement to end the war in 1973. That ended the American phase of the war. So the Americans pull out. That didn't end the war, continued.
Right.
Between 1973 and 1975, the United States continued to aid Vietnam, sent $3 billion, which is a fairly significant amount of money. Today,
especially in 1974 dollars.
Yeah. Today, the United States sends that to Israel. Virtually, that's like lunch money, right? The U.S. sent it to Israel. But that's $3 billion is a significant amount of money. As that happened, the war continued to go badly, and the Northern Vietnamese kind of just figured it was a matter of time. And in 1974, I believe, began a final offensive into Vietnam, right? To end the war. They began to build this like big highway network starting in the Northern Vietnam. They continued to use the Ho Chi Minh Trail, which went through Laos and Cambodia. They had these like 1,000-kilometer long resupply routes. And in December of 1974 began their offensive. They hoped to finish the war off in 2 stages. The final goal was to end the war by 1976. So in December of 74, the goal was to end the war in what is that, about 18 months or so. It didn't take nearly that long. On December 26th, actually, 1974, the Northern Vietnamese invaded. They crossed the 17th parallel with 22 infantry divisions, hundreds of tanks, thousands of artillery, and began bombarding Southern Vietnamese encampments and installations, and very rapidly moved through. Within about 10 days, they had taken over the Phuoc Long province in the north. And from that point on, they claim it went very rapidly. Le Duan, who was one of the heads of the Politburo at the time, he was one of the heads of the Politburo, one of Ho's old-time comrades. Le Duan said, "Never have we had military and political conditions so perfect or a strategic advantage so great as we have now." So there's clearly optimism there. And by March, PAVN divisions were in Ban My Thuo, which is an urban center, which is only 150 miles outside of Saigon. So they're getting very close. And that falls. And then by the end of April, we drive and march into Saigon. And this is when we see the famous, at the end of the war, the people escaping at the embassy, helicopters, and those scenes that we've seen a million times.
In the north, the PAVN, at this point, they'd had this plan for a longer sort of struggle because they thought the South Vietnamese army would be fighting back harder, where it completely collapsed, which this is also reminding me a little bit of what happened in August of 2021 in Afghanistan. But they changed their plans to go straight for Saigon because the ARVN was falling apart so quickly. And
yeah, it's pretty rapid. Initially, they didn't assume that, but I think the Easter offensive kind of was the same. The Easter offensive occurred far more quickly. The ARVN, by that time, the ARVN has, I think, the 4th biggest army in the world. So the ARVN has like huge numbers of people, but
trained and supplied by the U.S. military.
Trained and supplied by the United States, not exactly the greatest fighting force. Also, there's significant morale issues. A lot of people just bail. They know the war's coming to an end. They try to get their family out or try to escape. In 1975, when the war ended, the Vietnamese did, if they captured Southern officials, whether they be military officials or provincial officials or whatever, and they did put them in re-education centers, right? Because of what they had done. So a lot of people are trying to escape that. The Southern Army fell apart, but the Southern Army wasn't anywhere near what the Northern Vietnamese military forces were anyway. And so that ended the war that same week. And the United States, let me go back a moment. The United States, even though it had withdrawn in 1973, the new president, Gerald Ford, actually proposed sending aid in the spring of 1975, when it was very clear the Northerners were slicing through the South. And the Senate or the Congress rejected it. They said, no more. We've had enough. And so the U.S. finally is done. And that same week, the communist and Cambodian Laos achieved victory as well. And we'll mention that because I think Cambodia in particular is really, but so is Laos, right? So anyway, the war is over. And we don't have to go into much detail. I think what's important, though, is to understand what it meant for many years, for decades after Vietnam. When something came up, the media was always talking about, is this another Vietnam? And that became really, I used to do a bunch of interviews on stuff like that with the Gulf War. How does this compare to Vietnam? Everybody would ask me how to compare things to Vietnam. I just realized the other day, we're not really doing that anymore.
No.
Because I know, like, Gaza, for instance, kept reminding me of Vietnam, just the atrocities and the horrors and everything. I'm not seeing much, which I think is unfortunate because we kind of lost that idea about what the U.S. did. This is an immense war crime. It is a massive crime against humanity, Vietnam War. Still, if you want to go by the numbers, it's still the worst thing that happened after World War II. About 3 million Vietnamese killed, more civilians, more in the north, 1,500 villages in the south destroyed, 4.6 million tons of bonds, 15 million refugees in the area, many of whom were put out at sea, attacked by pirates, robbed, whatever. So just it's the eco side, Agent Orange and the dioxins and the groundwater. You still have 50 some years later, you still have children being born with horrible birth defects because of exposure to the environmental damage the United States did.
The sort of subsequent refugee crisis that happened in other parts of Southeast Asia after the fall of Saigon.
And millions of refugees coming to the United States. One of whom the other day was deported. This person is Vietnamese, been here a long time, and was deported the other day. And this is really a great example of the way the United States works, right? You go in, and you can even make this argument about Ukraine, which is a war I don't support. But in both cases, the United States went to the people of Vietnam, and they went to Ukraine, and they said, hey, you got to fight this war. We'll take care of it. We'll give you what you need. We'll pay for it. We'll give you your weapons. And so the U.S. does this in Vietnam. They, I don't want to say force it. Well, in Vietnam, I would say they forced it on it because there was no South Vietnam. The United States invented it, right? And they do this in Ukraine, too. Ukraine, obviously, the conditions are different, but still, Biden made that possible. Biden is the one behind the scenes who was egging them on and urging them on. We now know in both Ukraine and with regard to Israel that there were like substantial peace talks being undertaken fairly early on. And in both cases, the U.S., Joe Biden scuttled those. The other day, the article came out and said the Israelis themselves were shocked. They thought after the first few months of blowing up civilians, killing babies, that Biden would say, okay, that's enough. And like they were shocked that he kept giving them the green light. They expected him at some point to say, okay, that's enough. He wouldn't even do that. And you know what? So you have this it really is a tragedy. Like I said, 3 million Vietnamese dead. It's a mess there. And it unleashes all these forces throughout the region. I don't know, like we could maybe talk about Vietnam, then Cambodia, what actually happens, because I think it's, again, useful. The story of Vietnam is really interesting, too, because the United States lost that war, actually in 1973, but obviously in 1975 for sure. But still wasn't really, they didn't have a reckoning with it. You kept hearing after the war ended, and this is a great moment. I was young at the time, but I remember, like, the Vietnam War ended and Nixon resigned within like 6 months, right? So there are more than that. 6 months. Yeah, 74 and 75. So there was this real sense, like, of a kind of a
about 8 months. I think it was about 8 months. Yeah.
August to
April.
But there's this real sense of redemption. Like, we got rid of Nixon. We ended the Vietnam War. And there was still this kind of liberal hope. This isn't what America does shit. And there was this real sense like, okay, we're on the right track now. We can move forward now. We did kind of thing. And obviously that wasn't the case. That didn't happen, right? Like pretty much as soon as the war ended, you started hearing people talk about the Vietnam syndrome,
Right.
And that was the idea that the United States was too timid now to get involved in the world. And so the evil countries, the bad people, the bad actors were going to feel like freed and uninhibited because the United States, because of this Vietnam syndrome, probably wouldn't stop them, right? So that's one of the things that you hear in that moment. You would hear conservatives hated the end of the war because they said, you liberals have made us ashamed to be Americans. You've attacked us. None of that really happened. None of that really happened. I've always argued there really wasn't a Vietnam syndrome. And unfortunately, I've never written this down. I've always just blabbed about it. But even though the war ended and the United States lost, there's no doubt about it. It didn't like retreat. This isn't like isolationism in the 30s or anything like that. So the United States continued to fund bad actors all over the world. Remember, Jimmy Carter's elected in 1976. He becomes president in 1977. We've talked about Carter a lot, right? When Carter, in I believe his first press conference in 1977, Carter had campaigned talking about Vietnam. First, he said that he would provide amnesty to people, to the young men who left America to go to Canada, draft dodgers. And that Ford tried to attack that. Didn't really work, right? But Carter also said, somebody at a press conference asked him if the United States should help Vietnam rebuild. Because Richard Nixon in the final peace treaty had a secret codicil with the Vietnamese to give them $2.5 billion in reconstruction aid. Whenever I hear that phrase, secret codicil, you know what I think of, right? Dean Wormer. There's a little known secret codicil in the favorite constitution. Maybe that's Trump's model. It's Dean Wormer.
Or maybe maybe Dean Wormer is based on Nixon.
It could be. At any rate, though, so there's this secret codicil. Nixon and others contrived to negate that. And this is where they come up with the POW-MIA controversy, right? POW-MIA was initially a creation of Ross Perot and another, to get to the point, spoiler alert, it wasn't real. Everybody who's ever studied that, including John McCain, said there aren't any. McCain was a POW. McCain said there's nothing there. McCain thought that the people in the POW conspiracy camp were nuts. Like, they hated McCain. They still, to this day, they attack him and call him a communist. John McCain's a communist sympathizer. It's like calling
it's an early element of the current culture war we're in too.
I know, right? It's like calling Chuck Schumer's pro-Palestinians.
Yeah, or Wall Street are communists.
Wall Street is full of communists, right? Yeah. My God. Jesus. At any rate. So the POW-MIA controversy is ginned up to get people upset, to re-incense to redeem the war, right? Because, you know, the war ends badly. The United States lost, and it's destroyed this country, and now you have POWs and MIAs. So this is a way to flip the narrative and say, but look at what they've done to us. They're still holding our boys there. Bring the boys home, and people are wearing the POW-MIA bracelets, and there's all kinds of...
The flag. I live in Berkeley, California, one of an infamously liberal zip code. They still fly the POW-MIA flag at the post offices here.
Isn't it the only flag outside the U.S. flag that's required? And yeah, it's flown in all public buildings, or at least all post offices or something like that. And it was contrived. It's just not real. The best source on this is an older book by the late, great Bruce Franklin, MIA, or Myth-Making in America. Anyway, though, the point is that becomes a way to continue support for the war. Right? The war wasn't popular, but now you change it to the guys, the POW-MIAs, which is obviously a very visceral and emotional issue. So it's to get people right up. They have our boys there. It's like today with the Israeli hostages, right? That has this visceral reaction to people. And you want to talk POW-MIAs. The Vietnamese had, who knows, many tens of thousands. Like, people are blown up in the war. The bodies are never recovered. Of course, there's POWs and MIAs everywhere. Doesn't mean they're being held hostage. There were no Americans held in captivity. And in fact, Nixon refused to give them that $2.5 billion in the secret codicil that Dean Wormer promised them. And he cited POW-MIAs, right? If Vietnamese had a chance to get $2.5 billion, why would they hold POWs? Right. John McCain said. And the Vietnamese he talked to were saying, like, well, the war's over. We want to start rebuilding inside Vietnam. So that made it very difficult. In addition to not giving them that aid, the U.S. worked its magic, as always, with institutions like the World Bank and the IMF to prohibit the Vietnamese from getting reconstruction aid, right? So this is when, during the Vietnam syndrome, the United States is still waging war against Vietnam. Different kind of war, but war nonetheless. Withholding rebuilding funds, withholding international aid, humanitarian aid. anything like that. Now, at the same time it's doing this, remember, the U.S. is continuing to subvert governments all over the world. So again, this is also the period, and this is somewhat complex, but go ahead.
I was just to speak to that. You talked about how Carter is part of that. The foreign policy agenda doesn't stop. We're still supporting despots and dictators and anyone who's like fighting against some sort of like third world nationalism or whatever. When the U.S. ends its involvement in 1973, but Henry Kissinger is still National Security Advisor, Secretary of State through the end of the Nixon years into the Ford years. And we did a show on Henry Kissinger. It's a whole lot of history about this that everybody likes to talk about, but Henry Kissinger helps overthrow the Allende government in Chile, East Timor, lots of stuff in Africa. So the U.S. doesn't really actually change anything in its foreign policy. It doesn't go inward. Maybe culturally it goes inward, but not as far as like its foreign policy goes.
Yeah, although keep in mind too, though, Nixon caught hell from the right because he had reached out to the Soviet Union and China. And the end of the Vietnam War has to be, and I didn't say that earlier, but the end of the Vietnam War has to be looked at within that context too, because the overtures to the Soviet Union and China also were a way to try to isolate the Vietnamese, who were getting support from those two countries as well. So part of the reason, so the Vietnamese actually do see a distancing, especially from China, which we'll see is really bad, right? But even from the Soviet Union, right? So in that regard, Nixon kind of succeeded, right? He isolates, but at the same time, it doesn't help in Vietnam because the war is already gone by that point. So the irony here is that after the Nixon years, the right begins to attack him on détente, and especially on the strategic arms limitation agreements with the Soviet Union. So it's a very bizarre situation. But again, we keep saying this is the Vietnam syndrome. Americans are weak now. They're afraid to go on war. This is the point when the Committee on the Present Danger was formed. This group of people who were upset about Nixon and détente. And that includes both Democratic and Republican politicians. It includes all of the arms manufacturers. This is the source of the famous episode in the CIA when George Bush was CIA director, appointed a team to analyze the Soviet Union. They came back and said, Soviet Union's in bad shape. The demographers said that, economists said that, and they basically said, they painted a fairly bleak picture, which one would think would make you happy. Your main adversary is falling apart. That's not what Bush wanted to hear. So he buried that report, puts together another group, Team B, to come back with a very different alarmist analysis. So they're dangerous and they have this and we need to rebuild. And so that leads to an increase in weapons. And then Jimmy Carter takes over, and Carter, as we've said a million times, was admirable, in fact, inspirational after he was president. As president, he's an imperialist and a war criminal. And that's not being glib like he is. And so amid this Vietnam syndrome, in Carter's first press conference, I'm finally getting back to that. This is the way I teach, by the way. It's all over the place, but I actually do finally get back. But in Carter's first press conference, somebody said to the United States, oh, Vietnam, anything? And he said, no, the destruction was mutual. The destruction was mutual. The United States lost 58,000 Americans were killed in Vietnam. That's bad. Spent like $200 billion that could have been spent on a million different things at home. And this is a period when they actually are, like the Great Society period. They're doing stuff, but they could have done a lot more. So clearly, remember Martin Luther King's famous analysis that the dreams of the Great Society died on the battlefield of Vietnam. Clearly, and we're seeing that today, right, where we're ignoring just like massive social problems here at home on a daily basis, but sending pretty much blank checks to, especially to Israel and elsewhere. But so you have this Vietnam syndrome, but Jimmy Carter's not doing that at all. We've talked about that, right? And he's supporting the apartheid in South Africa. He supports Indonesia. He's trying to end the rebellions against American-supported dictators in Latin America. But to go back to China and Vietnam, because I think that's the most critical one, right? So when the war ended, the United States obviously isn't real happy about it. They deny aid to the Vietnamese and so forth, right? For Vietnam's purposes, though, the war continued, right? They can't get aid. And now, even though they've defeated the Americans, just like they defeated the French and the Japanese and the Chinese and a lot of others, but the Vietnamese now have a problem on their border with China, right? During the war, the United States believed that Vietnam and China were basically the same, that they were connected. And people no less than Noam Chomsky has said that's America's biggest mistake in the war. They persisted in saying the Vietnamese as just this puppet of China, when in fact it was never. Chinese Vietnamese hate each other in a lot of ways. And so after the war, Jimmy Carter cultivated that. And Carter increasingly went to China to encourage them not to support Vietnam. And this is also connected to what's happening in Cambodia. So Vietnam, after the war, now has to deal with renewed aggression from the Chinese. And in 1979, early 1979, with the encouragement of Zbigniew Brzezinski, the Chinese actually attacked Vietnam. So there was another war that really doesn't get much attention here in the U.S., right? I believe something like 20,000 or so Vietnamese were killed, about 10,000 Chinese were killed. So it's a major conflict. But the Vietnamese, I was like, be glib about it. The Vietnamese kicked China's ass, just like they kicked everybody else's ass. But that was Jimmy Carter. So Carter is contriving another conflict in that region, attacking Vietnam. And at the same time, so that's what's happening in Vietnam, right? So there's no Vietnam syndrome. The United States is actually still trying to destroy the Vietnamese communists, right? And this is going to continue. It really won't be until the 80s that you start to see things in Vietnam change, basically out of the desperation, right? They're still not able to get foreign aid. They can't get IMF aid. They can't get reconstruction aid or World Bank or anything like that. So in the 80s, not long after Gorbachev took over in the Soviet Union, you started to see a similar shift in Vietnam. So they moved away from their goals of developing a socialist economy and a socialist society, and they moved to more market-oriented solutions. And this was done under pressure, great pressure from Western institutions. They created, just like the Soviet Union had perestroika, that kind of economic restructuring with more market ideas. The Vietnamese had what they called Hanoi, which did the same thing. Right now, the problem with that, and this comes from Gabriel Kolko, a Marxist who was a huge advocate of the Vietnamese Revolution. But even Kolko has said that after that, what they did was essentially balance their desire for Western aid and reconstruction with their proclaimed support of the people who made the revolution possible, namely the workers and the peasants. So when push came to shove, these market reforms were created, which always involved privatization and cutting back on public subsidies and things like that. So the people who paid the price for it in Vietnam were the veterans and the peasants, in many ways, the people who made the war possible, right? And at the very end, we can talk about what's happened to Vietnam, and I like making this argument. I think the U.S., in a sense, actually ended up winning the war in the long run. Yeah. What's happening in Vietnam up through 1980. And the United States still has a very heavy boot on the neck of the Vietnamese. Now, at the same time, in 1975, that the war ended, the conflict in Cambodia had ended too. Cambodia was an American ally in the war early on, but it was also tried to be neutral. Cambodia, like head of the Cambodia, Prince Norodom Sihanouk, kind of allowed the Vietnamese to use the Ho Chi Minh Trail, but he also the United States. So he was trying to just stay as much out of it as possible, but that was increasingly difficult. And so in 1970, Nixon decided to make Cambodia another part of that war. There had been attacks on Cambodia. We often refer to the secret war in Cambodia. It's not secret to people in Cambodia because they get bombed every day. But after 1969, that picked up considerably. So the United States begins bombing the hell out of Cambodia in 1969 and 70 when Nixon becomes president, in large measure to prevent Vietnamese supplies coming in through the Ho Chi Minh Trail. That's the reason for it, right? Now, they also claim that the communist brain center, the Center of Communist Operations in South Vietnam, which is called COSMIC, the Center for Operations in South Vietnam, right? So they claim that. So in early 1970, in April of 1970, Nixon sent U.S. troops in to Cambodia as well. And this gives rise to things like the Kent State murders here in the United States. So the United States, now this also sparks a major crisis in the Cambodian government. Prince Sihanouk did not support the Americans at this point, right? He wanted to keep Cambodia out of it as much as possible, play both sides if he could. And so the United States began to increasingly see him as a barrier. So they had a coup in early 1970 where they got rid of Sihanouk and put in a new government led by a guy named Lon Nol, L-O-N-N-O-L, right? Nol basically did what the United States told him to do, so he approved of this invasion in 1970. In the long run, this is really important because it unleashes a force in Cambodian politics that hadn't been that powerful at that point, namely the Khmer Rouge. Khmer Rouge was Khmer Rouge isn't why the United States bombed Cambodia. The United States bombed Cambodia, hoping to prevent them from allowing the Vietnamese to use that as a through station for supplies, the Ho Chi Minh Trail.
Mhm.
And you've been in Cambodia, right? So you've seen, what actually happened there. The Khmer Rouge was unleashed. Before 1970, the Khmer Rouge was not a powerful political force. But with the United States invasion and then the renewed attack on Vietnam, the Cambodia became the symbol of resistance and increasingly picked up support, right, from the people of Cambodia. And to skip way ahead, in April of 1975, the Khmer Rouge won. Same thing happens in Laos with the Pathet Lao, which was communist. They'd all been fighting for 15, 20 years. And within a week, pretty much, they all come to power. So it's a massive bid failure for the U.S. in Indochina. Cambodia is really interesting because the Khmer Rouge begin this reign of terror, which you've seen, right? You've been to, what's the famous prison there?
It's in the middle. It's in the middle of Phnom Penh.
Kang something, Lowell, or I forget. Should have looked it up. But anyway, they go on the killing spree, right? And they kill who knows how many people. It's brutal. I often think of Netanyahu as Pol Pot to Cambodia, because they're just like indiscriminately killing people, killing children. They're killing people because they wear glasses. It's funny. Everyone's like, oh, Trump's putting people in jail because they wear a baseball cap or a tattoo or whatever. That's Khmer Rouge shit. They're killing people who had glasses on or who were too Western or whatever.
Tool slang.
Tool slang. Yeah, that's it. They're doing something. That was how most of Luol Deng, who played in the NBA for a long time. So this Cambodian reign of terror begins. Now, that gets a lot of attention in the United States, and it always has, right? But there's two things that are really important. One, the American bombing was every bit as catastrophic. Who knows in terms of the number killed? I don't know. But the U.S. bombing killed a lot of Cambodians, right? So clearly it was catastrophic, right? But it also unleashed the Khmer Rouge. And so Khmer Rouge genocide was made possible by the U.S. intervention and the U.S. coup and the U.S. destruction of Cambodia. Now, this is where it gets interesting, though, because Carter's president after 1976, even before Carter's that, right? The United States hates the Khmer Rouge, right? However, the Khmer Rouge's main enemy was Vietnam. In 1975, after the Vietnamese won, they proclaimed it now the Socialist Republic of Vietnam. The Socialist Republic of Vietnam and the communists in Cambodia don't get along. Ho Chi Minh and Pol Pot never got along, right? There was always animosity. So the Vietnamese became the resistance to the genocide in Cambodia. And ultimately, the Vietnamese sent troops in to Cambodia to overthrow the Khmer Rouge and put somebody they wanted, Hun Sen, in power. Chomsky often said that the idea that the phrase humanitarian intervention is very Orwellian, right? There are maybe one or two instances in modern world, Bangladesh, that would qualify as humanitarian interventions. And Chomsky always pointed out that he thought the Vietnamese invasion of Cambodia did. No matter the motive, they ended the killing fields. Now, here's where it gets fun, because the United States, even though it opposed Cambodia, and the American media talked a lot about the killing fields. This is the stuff in what's the famous movie about that, about Cambodia?
The killing fields.
Oh, yeah, the killing fields.
Yep.
Even though that's true, Carter began to support the Khmer Rouge. Basically, he's saying the Vietnamese illegally took over Cambodia. They are an occupying force, so we oppose them. And that becomes part of the China equation as well. The Chinese supported the Khmer Rouge, right, early on. So the United States and China are supporting these murderous, brutal communists in Cambodia, against the Vietnamese, who had defeated the Americans and who had intervened in Cambodia and ended the genocide. So Carter is supporting the Khmer Rouge, saying they are the legitimate government in Cambodia, even though they're killing millions, probably not millions, hundreds of thousands of people in some of the most brutal ways possible.
Right.
And this goes into the U.S. encouraging the Chinese to invade Vietnam. Part of that equation is to help out Cambodia as well. After Carter lost, Reagan comes in, claiming Reagan reinvigorates the Cold War, claims the Soviet Union and the communists are the focus of evil in the modern world. He wants to increase the military budget. Eventually, he wants to build Star Wars, all of things. But even Reagan's people, Al Haig and Jeane Kirkpatrick, went to the United Nations and defended the Khmer Rouge seat at the UN. Again, the United States is such a destabilizing influence. And so to say, oh, people are shocked what the U.S. is doing today, right? We're supporting like the Zelensky thing, or we're supporting Israel, right? This is what the U.S. does. This is what Americans do. American governments do. I mean, they support the Khmer Rouge. You support the Khmer Rouge, everything's on the table, right? And so that's another piece of this that I think is really important. And again, like the Vietnam syndrome, no, you know, Vietnam syndrome, you're not supporting this murderous regime, defending it at international bodies like the United Nations, and encouraging another great power like China to invade, right? So there's a lot now. And so that's a really important piece to this. Just with regard to Laos, I don't want to spend too much time. I think one of the important things about Laos is Laos too is destroyed. One UN group said that the Plain of Jars, which was an ancient civilization, I believe it's a UNESCO heritage site, one UN official said the United States bombed it so much there was no way for life to exist there anymore, like plants and animals and whatever. And as I said earlier,
it's one of the places with lots of unexploded ordnance too that we talked about.
80 million the cluster bombs they use, which explode into little, like baseball size. They're called bombies or bomblets. They're still 80 million.
Yeah, I've traveled on up in the mountains and in the Plain of Jars, and it's you're advised not to walk off the trails in which they have made.
Every year, like 100 school kids are killed. They get their toys or whatever. And so all this going on. To finish up, I think we're going to talk a little bit about the consequences or what it meant. And there's a couple of things I want to talk. We've talked about this, right? I want to talk about the pop culture and the way the Americans addressed it. And then I think maybe you could do that. Talk about like film and books or whatever. And then at the end, we can just mention like what the long-term consequences of it were, how it affected the United States.
Yeah, I would say there's sort of the one thing I'll start off with is that, which I don't think you've talked about yet, which is Reagan, where he frames Vietnam as a narrative, it's a noble cause. The quote is, "It is time we recognize that ours was in truth a noble cause. A small country newly freed from colonial rule sought our help in establishing self-rule and the means of self-defense against a totalitarian neighbor bent on conquest. We dishonor the memory of 50,000 young Americans who died in that cause when we give way to the feelings of guilt as if we were doing something shameful, and we have been shabby in our treatment of those who returned. They fought as well and as bravely as any Americans have ever fought in any war. They deserve our gratitude, our respect, and our continuing concern." And I think that's an important speech that he gave. That's an important quote from a speech that he gave, because when I think about the revisionism that went on with the Vietnam War, I think about Reagan. He's really plants the flag in that. Another quote that I wanted to say, shifting into the pop culture, because I think Reagan's influence was it was in response to the pop culture that happened before he was president, and then also influenced the pop culture that happened while he was president. But Tim O'Brien, in a book called The Things They Carried, like one of my actually all-time favorite quotes from a book. This is a novel about soldiers serving in Vietnam and the impact that it had on them. But he said, a true war story is never moral. It does not instruct nor encourage virtue, nor suggest models of proper human behavior, nor restrain men from doing the things men have always done. If a story seems moral, do not believe it. If at the end of a war story you feel uplifted, or if you feel that some small bit of rectitude has been salvaged from the larger waste, then you have been made the victim of a very old and terrible lie. There is no rectitude whatsoever. There is no virtue, and as a rule of thumb, therefore, you can tell a true war story by its absolute and uncompromising allegiance to obscenity and evil.
Yeah. Before you do the movies, let me say one more thing that I forgot. And the O'Brien quote just reminded me of that. One of the key elements of Vietnam that I think is really important, that needs a significant amount of attention, is the role that the actual soldiers and veterans played in opposing the war. And that's really an important piece too, because, and we're hearing the same thing today. I liken these groups, two of the bigger anti-war groups were GIs United against the war, and then even more, Vietnam veterans against the war. And they played a major role in opposing the Vietnam War. They had the Winter Soldier hearings at Dewey Canyon and John Kerry and all that kind of stuff. They remind me today that like groups like the JPV, Jewish Voice for Peace, remind me of VVAW. They're on the front lines. That is part of their heritage and who they are. And they get attacked, which is really quite ironic. And the O'Brien quote reminded me of that. So it's important to keep in mind too, when Reagan talks about the brave warriors and the brave soldiers and all that, many of them didn't believe that. Many of them opposed that. They opposed the war. They were critical of it. And that's an important piece to this too. And in the recreation of the war, you're also basically attacking the view of so many people who were actually there and fighting at the time.
So to get into the film aspect, which is, I think, where a lot of people get a lot of their ideas or sentiment or even quasi history, or maybe not quasi, or maybe fantastical history from is from a lot of the film. I'll say that I feel like the literature is actually much more interesting than the film. But there's a lot of film that came out in the 70s and 80s and into the 90s about the war in Vietnam. In large part, it focuses on the experience of the U.S. servicemen, like the traumatic experiences. And there's movies that we're going to talk about here that Bob and I are fans of, and there are movies here that Bob and I are not fans of. But all of them really focus more on the U.S. service people's experiences in the war. Same with, I'm going to talk a little bit about some television stuff too. But it's important to note that there's a few films, particularly in American cinema, that really deal with the Vietnamese perspective, or The Killing Fields actually does a fairly decent job of showing the perspective from a Cambodian that's depicted by Hang As Nor. But I want to say that a lot of it is very focused on the American servicemen's trauma and what they went through. The first thing I'll say is that during the actual conflict, Hollywood only produced one single film dealing with Vietnam. And what was that? What was that movie, Bob? What was that movie?
Silver wings upon their chests. These are men, America's best. 500 men will test today, but only one will wear the green beret.
Yeah.
You never thought you'd give me my last show in Texas, and I sing.
And you sing the Ballad of the Green Beret.
Perfect.
And so John Wayne's film, The Green Beret, is the only film that Hollywood produced during the actual conflict. And it was very much modeled on like John Wayne films from the World War II era, but also like Westerns like The Alamo and things like that. And there's a lot of similarities between those films around World War II and the fight for Texas independence and things like that in The Green Beret, I just want to say. But it portrayed...
John Ford could have done it, right?
John Ford could have done it. It portrays a bunch of decent Americans struggling to defend an embattled outpost along the Laotian border that was nicknamed Dodge City. But getting into, to be a little bit more serious, there's a couple of different sort of genres around the Vietnam War film. There's what has been called the sort of madman or the trauma wounded vet sort of films. And not all the films I'm going to talk about also actually took place in Vietnam. Some of them are just about veterans, or some of them are just like more metaphors for Vietnam. But Apocalypse Now is obviously like one of the most known, and it's where Marlon Brando plays Howard Kurtz. It's actually based on Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, which takes place in colonial Africa in the previous century. But Apocalypse Now is Francis Ford Coppola's Apocalypse Now is one of these films. The other one that I want to note is Taxi Driver, Martin Scorsese and Robert De Niro, where he's a New York cab driver, but he's also a sort of burnt out, traumatized Marine vet of Vietnam who goes nuts and tries to shoot a political candidate and then pivots that into having a shootout with a pimp and his gang to save a young girl. And so it's interesting depictions in that film. The other genre coming out of the 70s is what they call the sort of where we see the vets more as the victim. And the three here that I just want to note, there's others, but Coming Home, Hal Ashby's Coming Home with John Voight, who's a fucking right-wing nut now, and Jane Fonda. The Deer Hunter, which some of it takes place in Vietnam. Bob has a good point about maybe it's not actually about Vietnam. That also stars De Niro and Christopher Walken. And then First Blood, the first of the Rambo movies, is definitely about the sort of wounded victim vet. There's a quote from John Rambo in the first film, which is actually based on a novel. But he said, "It wasn't my war. You asked me. I didn't ask you. And I did what I had to do to win. When I came back to the world and I see all these maggots at the airport protesting me, spitting on me, calling me a baby killer." Which is also a myth, too. There's actually a great book called The Spitting Image by a sociologist who I'm blanking on his name, Bob.
Jerry Lemke.
Yeah, Jerry Lemke, who actually did some pretty extensive research and actually found no actual incident of anti-war protesters spitting on returning vets.
No, the opposite. Like when I was talking about VVAW, they wanted them. They would put them in front of the parade.
They set up anti-war coffee houses on the edge of bases to recruit vets to join.
There's a great
to join anti-war groups
called Sir No Sir.
Right.
If you haven't seen it, it's sort of like, did a hippie say something nasty to a vet? Yeah, of course. There's millions of people, but the idea that vets were being attacked on a sustained basis or anything is just, like you said, Lemke never found any real evidence that this happened. And most vets he talked, he's a vet himself, and most veterans he talked to said, oh no, they said, what was it like there? And they would like say, hey, we're having this thing. Would you like to come to it? That kind of stuff. So again, it's just another one of these myths. It's, people think lying began with Trump or something.
It's not like it's in the Bible or anything.
Yeah.
So then the next sort of era where we have a new genre around the Vietnam War is what I call the sort of fantasy or the hero or the refighting of the war. And this is most known by First Blood Part 2 or Rambo, which also stars Sylvester Stallone, where he actually goes back and rescues POWs. And it's basically a metaphor for going back and refighting and winning the war. Came out in the mid 80s. It's after Reagan had planted his flag in the revisionist ground. There was a bunch of other films which did the same thing post Rambo. There's Chuck Norris made these missing in action films. And then the other one I always like to flag, which is that I always like to talk about, which is actually doesn't take place in Vietnam and doesn't take place in the Vietnam era, is Red Dawn. And a few years ago, we actually did a show with a historian who wrote actually about pop culture during the 1980s. I can't remember his name right now.
Andrew Hunt.
Andrew Hunt. And so we talked about Red Dawn, which actually takes place in the Rocky Mountains. And there's a fabricated Russian and Cuban invasion of the U.S. And these high school students basically become a new sort of Viet Cong, except they're fighting the communists. And it stars the Brat Pack. So Charlie Sheen and Patrick Swayze and Jennifer Grey.
I don't know if you were going to say this, but I have to, because I saw the clip the other day. There's a very famous, what was it, 1978 movie by George Lucas, which was inspired by Vietnam.
Oh, yeah. It's called Star Wars.
Star Wars. Right. Just come right out and say, yeah, the rebels are the Vietnamese, they're the Viet Cong.
And everybody believes that, but MAGA, right? And so then we get into this, about the late 80s, we get into a different sort of like Vietnam War film, which I see is a little bit more sophisticated. And it's a little bit further down the road. It's a little bit more of it, but it's still also very focused on the vet and the serviceman's experience. And so the most notable ones out of this are Platoon and Full Metal Jacket and Born on the 4th of July. It's a focus on the loss of idealism, the breakdown of unit cohesion. I remember there's a line in Platoon about how there was a civil war brewing within the platoon between the sort of lifers, the soldiers who were very gung-ho about fighting the war and winning the war versus I think they were called the heads, who were like the sort of more...
The juicers and the heads, yeah.
The juicers and the head, and the heads are more like anti-war sort of hippie types who are also fighting in the war. And there's a famous scene where they're getting high in an abandoned bunker and having a big party. And then another element of all of these films is the struggle to survive and sustain a sense of humanity and integrity in the midst of the war. I also will say that all of these films actually, Platoon probably more than the others, really elevate how there's these class and race divides going on within the soldiers on the ground in Vietnam as well.
And Oliver Stone was a vet himself.
Yeah, and Oliver Stone was a vet himself. And there's a lot of interesting things.
Did that win Best Picture that year?
Platoon did, yeah.
Yeah.
And Oliver Stone won Best Director. And it also, Charlie Sheen, Johnny Depp, lots of actors. It was a breakout moment for a lot of those actors. I actually think...
Well, you can mention the Go Tell the Spartan Suit.
Let's do that here in a second. Okay. Let me finish this one thing. Is that the other Oliver Stone film, which kind of comes out in the same period as Born on the 4th of July, which is based on the sort of life of Ron Kovic, who was a Marine who was wounded and paralyzed in Vietnam and then became a leader within the Vietnam Vets Against the War movement, which I think is actually a better movie than Platoon. And I think it tells a pretty interesting story. And it also, like, what I like about it, maybe it's because I'm an organizer, is it actually really shows that sort of like transformation where he's this gung-ho ask not what you can do for what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. Like, kid joins the Marines, goes to Vietnam, and then is completely devastated around being paralyzed and being involved in war crimes, and then becomes an activist. And I think it's an important story and an important transition that happens. Abby Hoffman's in that movie too, which is awesome. And then there's Go Tell the Spartans, which comes out in the early 80s, late 70s, early 80s. And it tells a sort of different story about Vietnam, like the kind of stuff that you don't really see in these other films, which are very focused on the service.
I just mentioned that. I just think I think the best movie on Vietnam, and really doesn't get much attention, but I think it's well worth it. It's the early period, the advisory period. It's about an outpost in the United States, makes a stand there, and it ends badly. And it just shows the futility of it. It was based on an article, I believe, in the New Yorker, and I can't remember the author. It's pretty well known. But anyway,
It's in some ways it's the polar opposite of the John Wayne Green Beret film. It still takes place in an outpost.
I would absolutely recommend Go Tell the Spartans. But anyway, I just want to get that plug in.
And there's a lot of other film out there about Vietnam. These are just the ones that we think are important. I'll say just briefly on the television front, we also in the late 80s saw, and I think it's when we're in this more sophisticated sort of look at Vietnam and the sort of like after the popularity of Platoon in particular, two shows sort of lift up is Tour of Duty, which is not much better than a Rambo movie, but it's worth noting. And then the other one, which I thought was much more interesting, was China Beach, which is about actually women and nurses in Vietnam. They're the sort of main characters. And that has a very sophisticated look at class and race and gender during the war.
Yeah, but Hollywood played a major role in kind of getting over this mythical Vietnam syndrome. Reagan, in fact, at one point, like explicitly, didn't he say, I wish I could do the kind of things Rambo did or something like that? Because Reagan he didn't have a real sense of reality, so he would often invoke Hollywood movies. It's also interesting at this point, this is also in a lot of ways when our reckoning with Vietnam changes, because in 1992, Bill Clinton ran for president, and it came out very early that he had avoided the draft. He used some connections, got in the National Guard. Now,
he also supposedly went to an anti-war protest, which was like
in Oxford, right? And 4 years earlier, Gary Hart had to drop out because of a woman, right? And so in 1992, when that story broke, it seemed like it would be fatal to Clinton's, right? He's a draft dodger, right? But it wasn't. And then George W. Bush did the same thing. He got a posting in the National Guard where he didn't do anything, he got a DWI and stuff, but it didn't hurt him. And then now you have Donald Trump, who calls vets suckers and losers and skipped the war because of bone spurs and all that. So it's very weird how like we've changed, right? Where you go from the Vietnam War and these warriors are sanctified, they're beatific, to Clinton skipped the war, but that's okay. Bush skipped the war, he partied, who cares? Trump skipped the war, of course he did, and he hates vets, so what? It's a weird development, right?
Yeah, it's almost with Trump, the spin is almost, he's like, because Trump has opposed forever wars. And it's okay, he skipped it because we don't like war anyway. Previous generations, Reagan fabricated his involvement as a World War II vet, and Daddy Bush actually did fight in the war, in World War II.
Yeah, he was a bombardier, wasn't he, or a pilot?
Yeah, he was a pilot. He got shot down.
Covered.
Yeah.
And wasn't Daniel Ellsberg too? Ellsberg, did he have something? I think he did, yeah.
Ellsberg saw combat.
Yeah. Well, anyway, I think it's just interesting, right? How we've done this flip. So you can invoke Vietnam for kind of anything, right? I remember in 2016, Trump, somebody said something, I forget what the question was, about foreign policy, about this country doing bad things. I remember who it was. And Trump said, look at what we did in Vietnam. Holy shit. Nobody says that, right? Bernie Sanders never says that, does he? Maybe he does. But the point is, like, Trump said that. So yeah, you can use Vietnam. It becomes this flexible thing. You can mold into whatever you want. It's commodified, right? So you can turn it into whatever you want. And I always thought that was really striking, that just a few years earlier, you couldn't talk about vets. You certainly couldn't. I remember at the beginning of the Gulf War, I was living in DC, so we were going to all the protests and everything. And like the big theme that year was oppose the war, not the warriors, because they were buying into this. Vets were spit upon. So they wanted to make sure everybody knew they weren't opposed to the warriors, they were opposed to the war. And that was a product of Vietnam. So you really do see this kind of flip, which is striking. And
it's important to point out during the first Gulf War in particular, one, that's when George H.W. Bush says we've kicked the Vietnam. And then two, the other thing that you see really proliferate around the country are these I support the troops stickers. And that was like very much the sort of one of the, I'm sure that was like an establishment.
That was
media.
liberals. That was liberals.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. No, but established liberals.
Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah. Because they want to be accused of spitting on the vets.
Right. Exactly.
No, and I think that's really important too, because Bush said that it was in March of 91, I believe, really right after the United States ends the air war in Iraq. And he says, by God, we've kicked the Vietnam syndrome. The Vietnam syndrome, I don't think it existed. And also in the 80s, remember, This is what the United States is trying to destroy Latin America. It's in Guatemala, it's in Honduras, it's in El Salvador, Nicaragua. One of the things that it's, of course, it's the U.S. media right now with this shit going on in El Salvador. El Salvador, you can't talk about El Salvador without the war in the 80s. That's how MS-13 came about. That's how you have these repressive governments. The United States was waging this war and supporting really ugly, right-wing, brutal squads, Dubuisson and people like that. Yeah. And so what you're seeing today at CCOT is just a continuation of that.
It's important. Another thing we probably don't have time to get into too much. I think we talked about this in the episode from 2023, is the anti-war movement element. And there's the post-Vietnam element. We still have a lot of people who had been in the streets during the Vietnam era. They're involved in the Central America Solidarity movement of the 80s. And then we have this anti-war movement related to mostly George Bush's, but also Obama and Biden's machinations in the Middle East, everything from the invasion of Iraq to the support of the genocide in Gaza. But you don't actually hear, there was actually significant anti-war opposition to Desert Storm, to the first Gulf War, but you don't really hear about that. And that's why the liberal media establishment is trying to put out the "I support the troops" bumper stickers. And that's why George Daddy Bush basically says we've kicked the Vietnam syndrome.
We're going to fight with one hand tied behind our back. He said that at the time of the war began.
Yeah.
So hands are going to be tied behind our back.
Right.
This is a major part of the Vietnam syndrome. We weren't allowed to win. That was the Rambo thing. Didn't he say that? We're going to win. We weren't allowed to win.
Yeah. There's a line in Platoon from Tom Berenger where he says the same thing too.
Yeah.
About how the politicians in Washington are trying to fight with one hand tied behind their back or whatever.
And I'm not going to go off on this because I would talk for hours about it. That's the kind of my work is about, right? The military and veterans and soldiers. They never thought that. The military was, for the most part, opposed to the Vietnam War. That was a bad idea. What's reality and what's evidence and facts when you can let a good story get in the way?
And that sort of like media, the creation of those media narratives around that we've been talking about for the last half hour is actually a really important piece of the sort of post-Vietnam era. It's not only neutralizing like the opposition, it's also trying to neutralize like any kind of media critique of the war, of wars, right? That's why you have embedded media in 2003 in Iraq. That's why there's all kinds of media clampdowns of what the Israelis have been doing in Gaza, although they don't seem to do a really good job of stopping their soldiers from posting atrocities on TikTok. But what have you. The only other thing I would say about the sort of post-Vietnam era is it's also what leads to the sort of rise of the surveillance state and the sort of a more militarized police state. It's everything from the anti-Vietnam War movement, the Black Panthers, AIM, all those other radical groups that come out of that period also leads to a much more militarized police state.
Well, I think,
and COINTELPRO.
And in many ways, the core of the anti-war movement was younger people, students, people who burn their draft cards and so forth, and on campus. And you can't deny, I don't see how you can deny that what we're seeing today is really a response to that. After the 60s and 70s and seeing stuff, especially things like Kent State, where we did a great show on that, these other kind of campuses, I think it was very clear that education had to change. They didn't want that to happen again. And this has led to increasing crackdowns, and to the point where last spring, immediately places like Columbia had the jackboots out attacking the students, right? So it was ironic, right? These universities, these elite universities are being accused of being anti-Semitic when in fact they are denying these peace advocates on campus any kind of free expression. And so it's clearly a response to the 60s and the anti-war movement. We get a couple minutes. I want to just for a couple minutes, I just want to talk a little bit about what's happened since the war, because I think this is important, because one of my points I always make is that if Lyndon Johnson or Nixon really were alive, they would look at that and say, Jesus Christ, we won the war, right? Because Vietnam today is in many ways what the United States wanted to create, right? Vietnam has entered the marketplace, right? It's been on a march toward that goal since the 80s, but especially in 1994, Clinton lifted the trade embargo. It took 19 years after the war ended to lift the trade embargo. And then a year later, Clinton and the Vietnamese normalized relations. And actually, John McCain played a major role in that as well. In 2001, the United States and the Vietnamese negotiated a commercial treaty that removed tariffs. You can mention that at the end too. So as somebody say, and so trade really increased by 2007. Vietnam joined the WTO, which led to even more tariff reductions and more trade between the United States and the SRV, the Socialist Republic of Vietnam. In 2013, the United States and the Socialist Republic of Vietnam began what they called a comprehensive partnership, not just in the economy, but in military and environmental and education sectors. Since the 1990s, bilateral trade between the United States and Vietnam has increased over 200 times. A couple of years ago, last year, I found that the numbers. U.S. trade was about $3 billion just between the United States and Vietnam. In addition to that, the Vietnamese began to ship for more kind of light industrialization programs, and they had an average growth rate of about 6%, over 6% after joining the WTO, which was quite high. Their annual export rate grew 12 to 14% every year. Vietnam currently has over 22,000 foreign investment projects, which are valued at over $300 billion and include Samsung and LG and Toyota and Honda and Canon. And there, if you go into Vietnam, you'll see Burger King and Subway and Kentucky Fried Chicken and all that kind of stuff too. So the American empire, not just American companies, French companies, Japanese companies, Chinese companies, have really marched into Vietnam and planted their commercial flag there as well. And that's really important to understand. So this is how, like, when we talk about the war in, 2017, when Ken Burns's documentary came out and got all that attention. Like, Burns is still part of that liberal group that wants you to believe this was a noble cause and the United States tried to save the Vietnamese because they've been invaded and all this kind of stuff. The reality is very different. And on this 50th anniversary, I think it's really important to look at this and say, what really happened there? Like I said, for a long time, people would compare American, whatever it was doing at that point, to Vietnam. Is this like Vietnam? I had a bumper sticker in the 80s that said El Salvador is Spanish for Vietnam. And it's, I think, disappointing that we're not doing that today. When people talk about Gaza, there's a lot of this stuff, especially just the brutality of it. Hey, we really lost sight of just how brutal the American war in Vietnam was. You killed 3 million people. You blew up villages. You had incidents like My Lai happening on a fairly regular basis. And then there's a lot of this new scholarship. Like around the same time Ken Burns comes out with this, a lot of people Burns worked with were young historians who, some were Vietnamese Americans and others spoke Vietnamese or read Vietnamese and used the archives there. So this created this new wave of scholarship, which really wrote the Americans out of the war. The war now became the focus of the war with people like Le Hanh Nguyen and others was Hanoi. And they were blamed for everything, Le Duan in particular, right? And so you have this new literature by these people like Hanoi's War and Dong Vu, I can't remember what the name of his book was, but what they're basically doing is not even talking about the U.S. Keep in mind, 540,000 troops by 1968, 4.6 million tons of bombs, 3 million Vietnamese killed. I don't know how many thousands of farms and villages destroyed, Agent Orange still in the groundwater, ecocide on a massive scale. 15 million refugees, and yet the U.S. is written out of it because they want to blame the Vietnamese communists for their war of national liberation. So on this 50th anniversary, I just think it's important to look at this stuff and look at what really happened because it's going on again. And this is bipartisan empire. It's bipartisan war crimes. So I think it's important that we talk about this and get it out to show how it worked out, how it played out, how the Americans responded to it, both in politics and in popular culture, and hopefully learn something from it.
Yeah. I think on that note, we're going to let Saigons be bygones and wrap it with that. Folks, you've been listening to what has turned out to be an extended episode of the Green and Red podcast, talking about the 50th anniversary of the fall of Saigon. If you like what you hear, please check us out on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. If you're watching this on YouTube, hit that subscribe button. If you are listening to this on an audio platform, give us a rate and review. It helps us with the algorithms. And then if you really like us, go hit that support button and become a donor or become a patron at patreon.com/greenredpodcast. And we will talk to you soon. We have many more great episodes coming up. And until then, everybody make trouble and misbehave, and we'll catch you later.
Well, I won't man your tanks and jets and jeeps. And speaking on behalf of all my fellow creeps, we reserve the right to refuse service to you.
Right face forward, woo, and get the children too.
Let Saigons be bygones, don't you blow this world in two. We reserve the right to refuse service to you. Well, it's just my luck that God's a Texan, one big some bitchin' Anglo-Saxon, some crazy kind of tall Norwegian board. Just to have my body shipped air freight from Texas through the pearly gate, just ring the bell and leave me at the door. I'll be somewhere over Jordan swinging low. I'll hear them tape-recorded angels in lifelike stereo singing, we reserve the right to refuse service to you. Take your business back to Walgreens. Have you tried your local zoo? Our quota's filled for this year on singing Texas Jews. We reserve the right to refuse service to you.